No, it's not that we turn to the major issues, and today we have a paper, Difference and Differentiation, Food Delivery Platforms in Turkey, and authored by three colleagues. And today we have two speakers, and let me briefly introduce our guests. We have Mehmet Cansoy, who is currently an assistant professor at Fairfield University in Connecticut. And before that, he obtained his bachelor's degree in political science and international relations and master's degree in international relations, and finally, doctoral degree in sociology at Boston College. And his research interests digital inequality, technological change, sharing economy, and platform economy, relevant for today's paper. And he published his work in Theory of Society, Socioeconomic Review, Sociological, among the well-known journals. And he also co-director of the College of Arts and Sciences, Frederickson Family Innovation Lab, during the last 3 or 4 years. And we also have Duygun Ruben, who got his bachelor's degree in political science and international relations as well, and master's degree in modern Turkish history. He's currently a doctoral student at Boston College, Department of Sociology, and his research interests are platform labor, platform capitalism, labor studies, social policy, and urban studies. And we have two discussants today, Kadir and Andrei Shevchuk, who is there. Yeah. Okay, dear colleagues, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind introductions. It's a privilege to be speaking with you. I hope to get really good feedback from our discussants and from the audience in general. This is part of a project Duygun and I and our third co-author, Tayfun Mertan from Koç University, have been working on for the past 14-15 months. We hope to do another round of field work over the summer this year and wrap up our work on the platform economy in Turkey. So when we were first engaging in this work, again, a year ago, like beginning of 2023, one thing that really struck us was the large number of platforms that were active in Turkey. So this paper is our attempt at grappling with that. Like, why do we have so many, like specifically food delivery platforms? So let's start with talking a little bit about the literature background of this. Okay, let's see if I can get this moving. There we go. So the literature on the platform economy has been, it's a fairly new one, as you all know. It's been maybe 10 years, maybe 12 years, if you're being generous. And it's been primarily focused on developing an idea of what it is studying. So it's been really focused on like figuring out what's similar between Airbnb and Uber and TaskRabbit and Deliveroo and Grubhub. Like, what is this thing that's at the heart of it? And it's been fairly successful at this, right? Like we've had a lot of literature writing about platforms. We've had really fundamental shifts in the way we think about the economy. People have come up with ideas of like how this is a new phase of capitalism, how it's reorganizing sectors beyond the platform, how the institutional form of the platform is like diffusing across multiple like business areas that it had previously not been introduced in. And this has been a very useful thing. I've written in that literature, like I agree with most of its goals. And most of this literature has been focused primarily on what's been happening in the global north, and even more than that, primarily in the United States, because many of the largest international platform firms are based in the US. The institutional form at least seems to have originated there, as far as we can tell. And so much of the funding behind what's going on originates in the US. So there's been good reasons for the literature to study this. But in this paper, we're going to argue that this has been fairly limiting. Now, the extant literature, because it's trying to focus so much on like what's unique about the platform economy, what's this thing called a platform, has placed a lot of emphasis on isomorphic pressures, right? Like pressures that force platforms to act and operate in similar ways. There's been a bunch of explanations for these, right? Like, so Van Dyke's book is really heavy on, for example, the role that digitization played in this, right? Like how we digitized so much of our social lives and allowed platforms to take it over. People have focused on the preponderance of technologies and like how that shapes platforms to operating in very similar ways. Again, you can think of something simple like we all have smartphones, so everyone has to put together a smartphone app that's legible on a 4-inch screen, kind of thing. A lot of the rest of the literature is a bit more focused on the economics of platforms. So they focus on things like the winner-take-all dynamics because platforms are seen as these behemoths that are fueled by network effects. If they can capture larger market shares of consumers, larger market shares of producers, larger market shares of third-party businesses, by placing themselves at the centers of these networks, they're going to be able to leverage their network position into not just profit, but like rent, basically monopolizing these networks of exchange. There's been a lot written about this, and this is a fairly well-established feature of platforms. We call this network centrality in our discussion, and we have a couple of bones to pick with this idea, in the sense that empirically we seem to find that this might no longer apply to every single platform. The last isomorphic pressure, the last angle here seems to come from the financing models that have allowed platforms to propagate so far, which is venture capital financing. So Langley and Leishan a few years ago wrote about how venture capital firms appear to push similar business models across different contexts, basically forcing platforms that want investment to be legible to their investors so that they would be, investors would know what to expect. And also investors offering not just like pressures, but also like expertise in how to organize and run platforms that seem to push for the singular platform model that we've come to identify in the literature. And Van Dorn and Shapiro have recently argued in favor of understanding the primacy of these forces as well. Now, in our findings, we seem to find that that doesn't apply to every single platform, right? Like we don't have a singular platform like model that applies to every single platform we identified. So we try to do a bit of a deep reading on what's different, like where does difference come in platforms. So there's a pretty well-established tradition. Wallace and Shore call that tradition institutional chameleons, in which platforms in different contexts operate differently, right? Like so, Uber, when it operates in New York City, does one thing. When it operates in Los Angeles, does another thing. When it operates in Germany, does another thing. When it tries to operate in Turkey, it does another thing, right? Like Uber is not Uber across the world. It fits into its institutional background. And there's been a lot of research on this for other platforms too, with like fairly consistent findings, right? Like different regulatory frameworks, different macroeconomic frameworks change how the platforms operate. There's much less written about why platforms in a single regulatory macroeconomic framework differ from another, right? Like where does that difference come from? An initial attempt that we identified is the Kirchner, Dittmar, and Ziegler paper from a year and a half ago. They looked at the mobility platforms, so like Uber or like short-term car rentals and like e-scooter rentals in Germany, trying to figure out those different business models. And they identified again, financing is an important element there. So platforms that did not have venture capital financing seem to have different models. They also focused on incumbency, right? If the platform firms were owned by companies that had previous like activities in the areas they were operating in, it seemed to create some room for difference. More recently, very recently, a couple of weeks ago, Foster's paper came out focusing on what he calls variegated capitalism, trying to figure out how different understandings of the market, different ways of approaching labor create differentiated platforms, especially in e-commerce, and he studies Thailand. So we see our work pretty much in line with these last two papers, right? Like studying multiple different platforms in a single regulatory and macroeconomic context. I'm going to turn things over to Duygun for a little bit to talk about our methods and some of our initial findings.
Right. So we think it is appropriate to investigate difference and differentiation in platforms through a study of food and grocery delivery platforms in Turkey due to several reasons. The first one is that there is a long history of platformization in food delivery in Turkey, which started in 2001 with the establishment of the food delivery platform called Yemek Sepeti. And second, in 2023, we identified 15 food delivery platforms in Turkey, which they had, and these 15 platforms had various functions and sizes. And although there are like conflicting figures, it is safe to say that together these platforms employ tens, if not hundreds of thousands of workers. And thirdly, many Turkish food and grocery delivery platforms are also internationally relevant. For instance, the Turkish platform Yemek Sepeti is owned by the European food delivery giant Delivery Hero, while the Chinese Alibaba firm owns 87% of the Turkish platform Trendyol, and also the Turkish platform Getir is itself a major player in the world market, which we will explain more broadly in a while. So understanding the nature of the Turkish delivery platforms is important, and we think it has implications for our understanding of the platform economy in general. So moving on to case selection, we focused on a number of criteria. We identified 15 food and grocery delivery platforms in Turkey who were active in 2023, which interacted with consumers, partner businesses, and or drivers through the app, and also they facilitated the delivery of food and groceries. So those were the criteria for our case selection. In terms of methods, we studied these platforms through analyzing their publicly available information, including their corporate records in Istanbul Chamber of Commerce. And we also analyzed media coverage about them. We analyzed their internet presence through their own websites and their social media accounts. And we also obtained a lot of important information about these platforms through our interviews with 34 drivers who worked for the 12 of the 15 platforms. So we think that our major contribution to the literature is that we make a classification of platforms based on 4 criteria. So we take into account to what extent they pursue network centrality and growth. And we also investigate their capital structures and infrastructural technologies. So those are our 4 criteria: network centrality, growth, capital structures, and infrastructural technologies. So based on these criteria, we identify 2 major types of platforms. The first one is what we call conventional platforms, which are platforms that broadly fit the descriptions in the literature. These platforms pursue network centrality through their business models. They seek incessant growth. They rely on significant sources of funding, such as venture capital funding, and they use a familiar set of infrastructural technologies. And the second type of platform we identified, we call it ancillary platforms. And these platforms do not seem to pursue network centrality and growth, and they only utilize small-scale funding mechanisms or even lack meaningful funding. And for their operations, these ancillary platforms rely on partners that have established relationships with customers and other businesses. So we think ancillary platforms are a type of platform that have not been discussed in detail in the existing academic literature. So identifying this typology of a platform is one of the major contributions of our study. We can move on to the next slides, Hocam. So now I will talk about the characteristics of conventional platforms for a while. Those are our first set of platforms, first category of platforms. So first, I will talk about their business model. In our research, we saw that conventional platforms base their operation on three business models, which are amenable to the pursuit of network centrality and growth. We call these business models digital storefronts, dominant intermediator, and Q-commerce. These are three types of business models that are amenable to the pursuit of network centrality and growth. And we must also say that these are ideal typical formulations of business models, and different platforms adopt multiple of these business models simultaneously. So a platform could be both a digital storefront and a Q-commerce platform, for example. So what are these business models? How can we characterize them? So in the digital storefront model, the platform intermediates the relationship between the customers and businesses by enlisting businesses in its interface and enabling customers to place orders from these businesses. However, in these digital storefronts, the delivery driver who delivers the food or the grocery ordered by the customer is employed by the other business and not by the platform itself. And we can move to the dominant intermediary model. Okay, in this model, it is pretty much the same with the digital storefront model, but in addition to it, the delivery driver works through the platform as an independent contractor and not as an employee of a business. And then moving to the Q-commerce model, here the platform does not intermediate the relationship between other businesses and customers. Rather, the platform has its own grocery warehouses or ghost kitchens, and the platform facilitates the delivery of foods or groceries from these warehouses to customers through delivery workers who work for the platform. So we see that when we analyze the platforms, we see that most of the platforms that adopt these three business models that I have just explained pursue incessant growth through rapid expansions of their operations, through mergers and acquisitions, and also through internationalizing their operations. Let me give you several examples in terms of internationalization. For example, before being acquired by the European Delivery Hero platform in 2015, Yemek Sepeti, the Turkish platform, had operations in more than 10 countries. Another example of internationalization is the Getir platform. This is also a Turkish platform who expanded aggressively into the European market since 2021. In the process, acquiring, buying out 4 of its rivals, most notably acquiring the German delivery platform called Gorillas. And we can also say that in addition to internationalization, in terms of growth, the conventional platforms also expand the realm of their operations. For instance, Getir, who started out initially as a Q-commerce platform, very quickly expanded into being one of the main food delivery platforms in Turkey. So in addition to Q-commerce, it has also added food delivery to its portfolio and actually became one of the biggest food delivery platforms in Turkey. Another example of the growth of operations is the case of Yemek Sepeti platform, who initially started out as a food delivery platform in 2001, but it expanded into Q-commerce in 2019 and grocery delivery in 2021 through buying out some local startups who were engaged in grocery delivery. So through all these ways, these platforms pursue incessant growth. And here in this slide, you can see how the growth drive of Getir, the Turkish platform, in Europe has driven out its main competitors in Western European instant grocery delivery market. That's because Getir has acquired a lot of these competitors, and it also became so big that the other firms couldn't compete with it. So this growth imperative, we think, is visible through this map, which shows how many players in the European market have gone out of business or were bought out by Getir. So far I have explained that conventional platforms exhibit a tendency to network centrality and incessant growth. However, we also find exceptions to that in our research. So this exception is exemplified by a platform called Foodie. It was established in 2020, and it focuses exclusively on delivering food from higher-end restaurants. And since its founding, it has maintained its focus on the upper end of the consumer market, didn't try to expand to the lower end, and it expanded its restaurant partnerships relatively slowly, and it spatially restricted itself to the upper class neighborhoods of major cities of Turkey, namely Istanbul and Izmir. It only operates in these two cities, plus in a popular vacation destination called Bodrum. So it operates only in those cities, doesn't try to expand into other cities, doesn't try to grow that much. But in 2021, it started offering grocery deliveries in addition to food delivery from higher-end grocery stores, and even opened a physical store in the upscale Levant neighborhood of Istanbul. So it did engage in some growth, but not in the same way and not at the same scale as other conventional platforms such as Getir, Yemek Sepeti, and Trendyol. So moving on, now, so far I have talked about the business models and how that relates to network centrality and growth imperatives of the platforms. So this was one characteristic that we were talking about. The second characteristic of the platforms that we are looking at to classify them is their capital structures. So typically, the conventional platforms are either funded by large international firms who are driven by venture capital financing, or they are funded directly through venture capital financing. To give some examples, Yemek Sepeti, who was acquired by Delivery Hero in 2015, it was acquired for the acquisition of Yemek Sepeti was the biggest acquisition in the food delivery sector in the world at the time, with $589 million. So before being acquired by Delivery Hero, an international firm who is itself driven by venture capital financing, Yemek Sepeti had itself raised $47 million of venture capital through several funding rounds. More strikingly, Getir has raised $1.75 billion of venture capital since 2021, and Trendyol has raised $1.5 billion from multiple venture capital investors. And as I said before, Trendyol is the majority of Trendyol is owned by the Chinese Alibaba, and lately, in late 2023, Alibaba pledged another 2 billion investments in the company. However, again, also in the characteristic of capital structure, we see that not all conventional platforms rely on large international firms or venture capital for funding. One of the examples that demonstrates this is the Migros One platform, who is owned by Migros, which is one of the biggest grocery chains in Turkey. So to explain a little bit the story of Migros One, the grocery chain Migros already had a slowly growing online grocery ordering system since 1997, but it has experienced real growth in its reach after the second half of 2010s, when Migros acquired a grocery delivery service platform called Taze Direct, and it launched its own Q-commerce service in 2019, and it also bought a significant interest in a delivery company called Paket Taxi to facilitate its deliveries. So there were a lot of pre-existing platform infrastructures possessed by this retail company called Migros already, and in 2022, the grocery chain Migros consolidated all of these platform infrastructures under a single platform called Migros One. So this is how this conventional platform came into being, not through venture capital, but through an investment by an incumbent firm operating for more than 50 years in Turkey, who already possessed a lot of platform infrastructures. Another example of this exception to the capital structures of conventional platforms is the platform called Foodie, which I explained just now, which is a platform focusing on delivering food from higher-end restaurants. So this platform, it is funded through small amounts of cash raised in 3 seed rounds, the largest of which was $3 million raised from the owner of a luxury lifestyle brand in Turkey called Vakko Holding. So again, here we see a platform coming into being and operating successfully, not through venture capital, but through other means. So the final category we were investigating to classify platforms are their infrastructure technologies. So in terms of infrastructural technologies, we see a great convergence among conventional platforms, in the sense that they rely on infrastructural services that are industry standards, such as Amazon Web Services and Google Maps. Also, we see that their consumer-facing apps adopt very similar interfaces and affordances. So in that regard too, they are similar in terms of infrastructure. However, we also see some cases of significant investments in tech development by these firms. For instance, the firm Yemek Sepeti uses its self-developed mapping and navigation system, and not of the Google Maps. But we should also say that the workers of Yemek Sepeti we talked to commonly complained about this mapping system, so which makes it unclear for us whether using these kinds of in-house tech systems are really beneficial for platforms. So now I pass the presentation to Mehmet Hoca, who will continue explaining the second type of platforms, which are ancillary platforms.
So as you can see on the slide, what we discovered was the vast majority of the platforms we were studying did not fit the picture that's very common in the literature about what a platform is that Duygun just spent a decent amount of time explaining. So I'll try to highlight the differences more than going into details of every point, especially in the interest of time. So one of the things that really stood out to us was these platforms that did not fit the conventional paradigm really did not seek network centrality. They did not interface with the consumers at all. They did not try to interface with the consumers. They didn't offer their own branding. They often did not advertise the public. They were very content with just working with other partners who had a pre-existing relationship with consumers. So what do we mean by this? So for example, Iş Express is a very small platform. It employs somewhere around 3,000 delivery workers in I think 5 major cities in Istanbul. However, it's owned by a company that has franchising rights across Turkey for like fast food restaurants like Pizza Hut and KFC and Krispy Kreme. So Iş Express doesn't have an app for consumers. It doesn't try to advertise to consumers. But when those consumers want to order KFC or Pizza Hut or Krispy Kreme, they go on those web portals, their ordering platforms, they place an order, and Iş Express gets that order and then delivers it. So at no point does it interface with the consumers. And many of the other platforms here, not many, all of the other platforms here work that way. So the consumer relationship is captured by their partner. They only offer delivery labor to their partners. On top of this, these types of platforms don't seem to pursue growth in the same way. So I just talked about Iş Express here, which is a very small company. Again, I just said like 5 major cities, a couple hundred delivery workers. The 3 other companies you see here work in very similar fashion. So Paket Taxi is now owned by Migros. It doesn't try to grow its own business. It just serves Migros and a couple of other restaurants, offers them delivery drivers. Fiu is owned by another large corporate like food business that has franchise rights to other American fast food restaurants, and it offers its delivery services to those restaurants and a couple of others that are not owned by its parent company. So it seems like for this subset of ancillary platforms, they're mostly about playing defense. They are trying to just capture the additional revenue that other platforms would capture if online orders were to go through one of the conventional platforms. And in fact, all these restaurants that I mentioned do offer their food through the conventional platforms as well. So this is at best like a marginal value capture strategy, right? Like, so that if you can divert a few people from Yemek Sepeti or Getir or Trendyol into your own ordering and delivery platforms, you get a couple of percentage points back on your food order, and your profit margins increase a little bit. All of the other side of the growth strategy here appears to be mostly about securing a scalable labor force, so that if you have enough surplus labor, enough contracted delivery drivers to accommodate surges in your partners' businesses, you'll be able to get some value out of that. So what they're trying to do is not to maximize their market share or anything, their market share among consumers or other businesses, but they might be trying to maximize their market share among workers, so that they can offer a highly scalable labor force to their partners, which makes them very attractive. the capital structure of these ancillary platforms is actually not that interesting, in the sense that not much seems to be happening. A couple of them are funded by incumbents. I already talked about İş Express and FIU here. Tıkla Gelsin is also funded by the parent company of FIU. It's an online ordering service. And Paket Taxi is owned by Migros. But those companies have not sought further financing, right? Like, they're not trying to grow their business. They're not trying to raise more funds to do more of what they're doing. They're fairly content where they are in terms of funding. All of the other platforms here have either very limited funding. So, for example, Vigo, which was founded through a Dutch subsidiary of Getir, has its own initial funding and hasn't pursued further funding. And the others here, things, the ones like Couriermex and Hemen Courier and Point Courier, as far as we can tell, they do not have any other meaningful funding other than what their founders put into the companies. These companies, these ancillary platforms, use the same set of infrastructural technologies that conventional platforms do, right? Like, so they use Amazon Web Services to host their apps. They use Google Maps for navigation. Their software that faces the businesses, for example, for order tracking, looks and operates in fairly similar fashion to every other piece of software that conventional platforms offer. They also offer to their partners order management, order tracking, delivery management software packages that is fairly generic. And as far as we can tell, it seems to be produced by third parties that these platforms are purchasing and just slightly adapting. So now that we've talked about these two different types of platforms in detail, we want to explore why this might be happening. Why do we have this big divergence and explosion of numbers of platforms? And I'll pass the baton to Duygun to talk about it for a second.
Thank you, Hocam. So, as Mehmet Hoca said, we ask how is this complex ecosystem of food delivery platforms are produced, and we argue that this complex ecosystem becomes possible due to the lowered barriers of entry in three critical areas, which are the regulatory environment, capital requirements, and the labor relationships. So looking at the regulatory environment, we see that the lack of meaningful regulatory action by the state plays a significant enabling role in platforms' emergence and growth and their differentiation. So a major aspect of this is that Turkish food and grocery delivery drivers are not formally employed by the delivery platforms, but they work through these platforms as independent contractors, which means that they are excluded from the protections offered by the formal employment status. So we think that the ability of food delivery platforms to mobilize the labor of tens of thousands of drivers without having to offer them the protections granted by the formal employment has been critical for their success, mainly because it does reduce a lot of costs for these firms. And the state does not challenge this development. In fact, it actively encourages it through several forms of tax breaks applying to independent contractors. And in addition, the only prominent legal challenge to drivers being classified as independent contractors was facilitated by a union active in the delivery sector. They opened a suit against a platform firm, but this case has languished in courts without a single hearing happening until now. In addition, the Turkish state also offers some tax privileges to platform companies working on technology development. So we think of that as another enabling factor for the success of platforms. And overall, we think that this permissive regulatory environment is one of the factors which enables the emergence and success of different types of platforms. Although we should also say that we also see some small steps in the shape of antitrust enforcement, as the Turkish Competition Board fined Yemek Sepeti in 2016 and Trendyol in 2023 for their anti-competition practices. But that is the only type of regulation that we have seen so far. Now I pass the presentation to Mehmet Hoca to explain other factors.
So, as Duygun explained, regulatory environment we think is one of the primary determinants of why we have such like wide diversity and explosion of organizational forms in this field. The second reason is we believe the capital requirements for a platform to be successful have gotten significantly lower. So platforms, conventional platforms that were already existing earlier, already did a lot of capital intensive work, right? Like they shaped regulations, they lobbied regulators, they basically allowed this misshapen form of independent contracting to be accepted and supported and even like uplifted through the government. They've also spent significant amounts of money developing the gig workforce. As much of literature discusses, getting people to do this kind of work, initially at least, requires platforms to pay above and beyond what the labor is actually worth to them. There's been a lot of work with like Uber, for example, with like increased payments to drivers to get enough of a workforce, and then constant cuts over the following decade. Similar things appear to have happened in Turkey as well. At least from our interviews, we know that. Again, it's really hard to untangle it from the economic crisis Turkey has been living through the last couple of years, but driver satisfaction with their pay seems to have gone down quite a bit. And finally, again, the existing conventional platforms already got restaurants and like small grocery stores up and running with digitization, right? Like they trained them on how to use their order management systems. They might have transferred some technology to them and like shaped their operations, which is the costly part. And then switching those skills to other platforms is now a lot less costly. And again, in capital requirements, it appears that infrastructural technologies and plug-and-play software seems to play a big role. We've already talked a little bit about this earlier. Finally, and I know we're running up against time, I'll be very quick. We think the ultimate triumph of independent contracting plays a huge role here because it did create this like large labor force that can be organized for free, basically, right? Like as long as you sign a contract with the drivers, you do not have to pay them anything. They're on call, and because of the pay structures, they're usually willing to work long hours. I think in our sample, on average, we have like people working something around 60 hours a week. Finally, one question we have here is, it seems like some of the larger platforms, so for example, Yemek Sepeti uses Hemen Courier and Point Courier as labor providers, right? Like they use their drivers on the Yemek Sepeti platform, and Getir uses Vigo on its platform, and Fiyu uses a couple of other smaller platforms on its platform. So we're trying to figure out, is this a case of driver saturation? Like, do these platforms no longer feel the need to directly hire their own drivers because there are so many gig workers that they can basically contract it out for cheap, even cheaper than independent contracting would be? Or is it a case of risk management? Are they trying to hedge their bets against more labor activism, more protests, more like media coverage of their how they do their businesses? That's a question we're still trying to entangle. So very briefly, we think our work, as Duygun mentioned at the beginning, is really important because it identifies this new type of platform, and we offer this way of classifying platforms into these two broad categories. That's a really important thing because the literature is at a point where this type of intervention is really ripe. As we saw, there's been initial developments in this area, and understanding platformization as a differentiated process where different institutions can do different things is really important, instead of trying to still fit everything into the straitjacket of platformization is this one thing. In addition to that, in our work, what we found was this division between the platform firm and the non-platform firm seems to be much more porous than initially thought. Tiny firms, a couple of hundred workers, maybe a couple of dozen workers, honestly, have started utilizing platform technologies, and understanding how that is evolving requires us to kind of do away with that border between platforms and not platforms. Thank you all very much. I know we went over a tiny bit, and we hope to hear from the discussants and your questions.
Thank you so much. And now we return to our discussants.
Okay, good evening. And merhaba, Mehmet, Duygun. Thank you for taking part in the seminar and your presentation. To me, the paper discusses the issue of why platforms have different business strategies in the context of Turkish economy. And I really valued 2 points that I think are important contributions to the literature. First one was how this labor regime, and as well as the capital structure in terms of the lack of the need for finance, is actually causes the emergence of what you call ancillary platforms, but what I would call maybe subcontractors, basically. And secondly, how the capital structure also causes the emergence of what you named as playing defense platforms, like platforms that are actually conventional businesses in the food industry, but then they try to protect their revenues by funding their own platforms. I think these are important and interesting findings, and definitely new to the literature. I have my criticisms basically on 3 points, and first is how you structure the paper. So I think it will be more beneficial if you focus on these 2 original points and you undertake actually a lot of categorization, starting from the business models. You categorize based on conventional and ancillary and uncategorized, and then on business strategies throughout the paper. But not all of these categories necessarily contribute to the analysis and lead to conclusions to me. For example, I couldn't understand why some platforms pursue growth at all costs, and why others try to grow only domestically, like Migros that you give an example, or like in the example of Foodie, they try to grow slowly, maybe in a different way than others. And then when you try to categorize all these players, you also, in the end up with the odd one out category, or some platforms are not unclassified or are not exampled within some categories. So I think these 2 important points and contributions to the paper maybe should be the main focus of the paper in terms of this general, let's say, photo of platform economy in Turkey. So this, to me, it complicates the argument of the paper and doesn't lead necessarily to an analysis and creates uncategorized examples. My second point would be on the data you used and how you position the paper within the literature. So I saw that the data is based on worker and union activist interviews, archival data, and press coverage. But in the same time, when you're asking the question why there are so big diversity within the platform ecosystem, you are actually trying to analyze some business strategies. And is it possible to infer such strategies from this data? Like, what I mean is, it will be much ideal if that if you had data from the platform side, platform management, platform ownership. And I think in this case, when you are basing your data on worker interviews and archival data and press coverage, for me, this will be a better example of situating this paper not just on Turkey, but on another literature that you mentioned, is the literature on varieties of platformization, basically, because it will be a stronger inference to establish a connection between peculiarities of Turkish regulatory and capital markets and the resulting peculiarities of Turkish platform ecosystem. So, and when you try to explain these specialties by reference to other kinds of and forms of platformization within different economies, I think you will have a stronger point when you're making your connections and your analysis. So I think you should compensate through this positioning of the literature. You should compensate for the lack of platform data. And this would also, I think, make the paper and these categorizations less descriptive by referencing to different varieties of platformization. And regarding the data, Mehmet, you mentioned some instances where you benefited from the interviews. But when I read the paper, it's hard to understand how these interviews actually contributed to the analysis, because there are no interview quotes, and I think when you read it, it seems like the data could be easily taken from your archival data or press coverage. So I think you may want to clear this when you mention the data sources, like how the interviews actually contributed to this analysis. And I have my last 3 points is on some needed, I think, background information on the Turkish context. I think reading your categorization on capital structures and on specific platforms, because I have some knowledge and experience on platforms in Turkey, so I could see how platforms actually developed historically in Turkey. And I think this historical development lens would contribute a lot to the paper. I think you can even make a periodization, like Duygun mentioned, when platformization first started in this sector, for example, when the Yemek Sepeti was the only actor. And then we have the entry of Getir and basically creating a market out of market products, the delivery of market products. And then we had the pandemic, and then this delivery worker protest. So we have different periodizations in the history of delivery platform work in Turkey. And I think if you give this, it would strengthen this capital structure and this histories of different platforms in Turkey. And secondly, I mentioned that these ancillary platforms is basically subcontracting platforms. And I think you need to also reference the literature on subcontracting work in Turkey, because this is not specific to platform economy, as I know that you also know that it's a very prevalent practice, the subcontracting of work, not just in service sector, but also in public sector or in manufacturing also. So it's something deeply rooted in Turkish economy, in all kinds of, all segments of the Turkish economy. So I think you need to give this background if you're going to explain this emergence of ancillary platforms, although it doesn't necessarily stay within the, let's say, within the coverage of labor law. Of course, here the workers are independent contractors, but still, this practice of subcontract work is or ancillary platforms is closely related to a general trend of subcontract work in Turkey. And thirdly, I think the paper would also benefit from a clear explanation of what is this independent contractor, or as we know from this translation from the Turkish name, the small business courier. So you mentioned the state supports this program by giving incentives and other forms of promotion, but we fail to understand what is it exactly. For example, its legal basis. For example, it's not based in the labor law, but rather it's based in the obligations law. So what is this status? I think the paper also needs this background information. So these are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kadir. Now, Andrei, it's your turn. Welcome.
Dear colleagues, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Dear authors, Mehmet, Duygun, I'm very glad that we're having you at our seminar. For people like me who are deeply interested in platform economy and platform work, it is a great pleasure to speak to counterparts who are deeply engaged in the debates on platforms. Dear Mehmet, I of course familiar with your papers, co-authored with Juliet Shore, which are important contribution to the topic. I also want to thank Kadir for bringing the colleagues here and organizing this event. So let me move on to discuss the present draft paper. I agree with many comments of Kadir. First of all, this paper was attractive for me because my personal research interests are gradually moving from workers' experience on the micro level to macro issues, including the general structure of the gig economy, institutions, and national models. And the authors investigated the important sector of the gig economy and presented a new country case, Turkey. I believe that varieties of platformization and emerging national models of the platform economy are hot topics now. And the last but not the least, the paper is very good written, I think. The arguments are clear, the logic is evident, and English is almost perfect. Nevertheless, let me make some critical comments that hopefully can help to improve the paper. But have in mind that in my research, I deal mainly with digital labor platforms. It means my perspective is informed by particular type of literature. However, food delivery platforms are conventionally considered as labor platforms, so it is a good excuse for me, I think. I won't go into details. I have two, I think, major comments, I would even say critical comments. First, authors bet on using a distinct approach, which was arguably neglected in the previous literature. Authors diverged themselves from comparative perspective on national platform economies and argue to show the variety of organizational forms within the same regulatory context. In other words, they want to investigate varieties of platforms holding the institutional context constant. By doing this, they hope to contribute to the literature, as far as I understand your idea. However, I'm not sure the author's plan has worked, and I see the value of paper differently. I argue the contribution of this paper lies exactly in what authors explicitly tried to avoid. The paper presents yet another country case. It provides interesting and important details on the political economy of platformization in Turkey, including the role of the state. Authors revealed distinct features of the emerging Turkish model of the platform economy. I will talk about it later. So my advice to the authors would be explicitly frame the paper as a country case, which contributes to the varieties of platform capitalism agenda, and embed their main question about variety of organizational forms within food delivery sector in this new focus. So I see it this way. Second, the second point of my critique will be the very notion and understanding of platforms as they presented in the paper. I argue that some of the organizational forms authors investigated are not platforms at all, in classical sense, and some have only platform-like features. If the company uses digital technologies, has a website or an app to provide services, it does not automatically mean it is a platform. We still need to differentiate among different ways of digitalization. I prefer to use the term platform theoretically as an ideal type, a distinct organizational form. Real firms can correspond to this abstraction to varying degrees and constitute hybrids. Of course, it's not easy to construct a proper definition of a platform, but one should try to differentiate between different understandings. In a very general technological perspective, digital platform could be any information system that connects different groups of users. In this sense, platforms can be even, there can be even intra-organizational platforms within the organization. In a narrow organizational perspective, platform is a distinct form of organization where a platform firm provides a digital infrastructure and rules of the game for external actors which interact among each other. In this perspective, the core activity of platform firms is to create and govern markets. Let's look at the organizational forms that are presented in the paper. Quick commerce type. It's, in my opinion, it is not a platform at all. It is a normal company that uses website or an app to sell its services to the end users. The core activity of this firm is, first of all, to prepare food and sell it using digital channel. Delivery provider. It is not a platform either. This type of firm is a subcontractor to deliver orders. It was mentioned in the paper that these firms can serve to only one or few food producers, as I understand. And Kadir also said about this. Digital storefront. Here we see some platform features. The company created an infrastructure for producers and customers to interact. Okay, it's a kind of platform, but it could not be called labor platform because there are no self-employed workers in this scheme. The food is delivered by employees. So it's a platform, but not a labor platform. And only dominant intermediator is a classical digital labor platform, as we know it. If we take the logic I presented, the distinction between conventional and ancillary platforms, which is made in the paper, does not work, I think. For me, only dominant intermediator and digital storefront are conventional platforms. But the latter is not the labor platform, as workers are not recruited through the platform. Of course, all I said does not ruin the whole analysis made in the paper, with many interesting distinctions among companies. I only argue the following: the authors investigate food delivery sector, not food delivery platforms alone. Food delivery sector. The authors investigate digitalization, not only the platformization of this sector. The analysis can be aimed at answering the question why in the digitalization process different organizational forms emerge, including conventional platforms. So, like, to answer the question, authors discuss many peculiar features of the Turkish economy. That is why I propose to present paper like a country case and encourage the similar research in other countries. I personally found most interesting parts on regulatory environment and labor relations. I personally published a similar research on the Russian gig economy in Russian language, though. But I'm going to develop an advanced version in English in future. And I see very interesting points for comparison, especially concerning the role of the state in the promoting neoliberal regulation of the labor relations in the gig economy. And I would like to learn more on that in Turkey. Some small additional comments. I also prefer to learn more about capital and management structure in the food delivery sector. I think it's very important because, for example, in United States, in Europe, many main platform companies, key platform companies in delivery sector also are public companies, standalone public companies. For example, in Russia, for example, and as I know in China, and maybe as I see, there are some cases in Turkey also. These delivery companies, in fact, they are not independent players. They are part of the greater ecosystems with big tech companies, which have it like a particular business within their whole economy. So it should be investigated further, I think. When I read the conclusion, I realized that authors are well aware on the many issues I raised today. They state that the rigid boundaries between conventional platform firms are blurred, that we should see platformization, I would still rather say digitalization, as a spectrum, and locate firms as being on different points along it. I absolutely agree, but I prefer to see this statement in the very beginning of the paper, to have it as a starting point of the analysis, not as a side remark in the end. So it's, I think it's two major points which I like to share with you. And it was very interesting to see, as I see it, yet another country case. Thank you very much. It will help me personally in my work further. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you both, Kadir and Andrei. These were very informative comments, and believe me when I say we will take them to heart. This has been a project that's been in painful development for 8 months as we try to figure out what exactly is it we're trying to figure out here. And both of your comments have been very helpful. A couple of quick remarks, and then I think we'll take some questions from the audience if I remember correctly the format. Andrei, I fully agree that there's a debate to be had about whether this is platformization, digitization, like what exactly is this a case of. I still would like to think of what we're identifying as distinct forms of or distinct spectrum points of platformization as like firms move from one to the next, even though they're not really moving. I guess they're picking and choosing different forms, only because so much of the debate around, especially labor here, has happened around platformization, right? Like we haven't really talked about like the casualization of labor through digitization literatures, and part of what enables it are the platform-like features that you're talking about, right? Like having an app to manage people, the development of the subcontracting, like habitus, right? Like getting people to actually work in the forms that the firms like them to work. So I think, and again, I fully think your point is a very fair one to make, and I'll be thinking about it for a couple of days at least after this call. But my initial reaction is, because where the literature has been, this platformization might be a way to push the ideas a bit further. But as I said, I think that's a very fair point to make. In terms of, is this a country case, or is this pushing against the varieties of platformization literature, or we should call it the developing literature? There is so little on it already, but the idea is definitely out in the out in circulation. I would suggest two things. First of all, the framing you suggested would work. I still think what we're finding, or what I want to push forward, is the more international, like theoretical contribution, in the sense that we are finding delivery providers, platforms, or digital labor firms, or whatever we call them, in a couple of other contexts. We just recently, last week, when trying to redraft this paper to send out, we found one operating in the US. We found a couple of other cases where already existing platforms, so for example, Delivery Hub in the US and Instacart, are becoming delivery providers, giving up their consumer interactions in the US. Getir, we know, has been pushing this type of subcontracting to another platform in a couple of its European markets, where it's not already shutting down its services because regulation has made it impossible for them to be profitable. So I think there's a point to be made that this is not just Turkey, but obviously that point has to be made in the paper, and it currently isn't. So I really thank you for pointing that out. And who knows, maybe reviewers will agree with you and we'll have to reframe the paper afterwards. Kadir, again, all of your points are very well made and very well taken. I think, especially about the structure of the paper, I agree we do need to highlight our findings a bit better. And again, that's the point Andre made too, like we should move the spectrum of platformization stuff at the beginning to like actually frame what we're discussing in that way. In terms of the interviews, I think that's the that's the only thing I'll just add here, because it wasn't in the paper. We use interviews as basically key informants of operations, because the public information, the records, the media coverage tells us some stories, but then we go in and we talk to the actual drivers, and they tell us, for example, someone who was driving for Hemen Kurye told us, oh yeah, I work for Hemen Kurye, but we actually work on the Yemek Sepeti most of the time, right? Like the Hemen Kurye basically subcontracts us out to them. Or people driving for Vigo helped us figure out that there was a relationship between Vigo and Getir, because it's nowhere to be found in the public, right? Like you can't see it, they don't talk about it, but every Vigo driver knows that they drive for Getir. And then we had to do a bunch of dig through like Dutch Chamber of Business records to figure out, oh God, there's like 5 hops you make from Getir to Vigo because Getir funded Vigo. So that's how we use them, instead of like quotes and like qualitative stuff, because drivers don't have too much to say about like the macroeconomic context of what's going on usually. One final thing, can we ascribe business strategies from our data? Most of our data is like interviews with founders, interviews with funders, public statements that the companies are making on their websites. So that's how we get the strategy bits, at least from that data. We've tried to push for some like management interviews, but these companies are not public. They don't feel the need to engage with researchers in the same way that like companies that are otherwise that otherwise would have. So we will keep pushing for that, but I think even without that, we have enough to ascribe intent and strategy to what they're doing. Hopefully, other people will agree. But yeah, everything else I fully agree, and we do need to reframe the paper significantly. Thank you both. It was really wonderful to hear from you and have you guys comment on our work.
Thank you. Okay, guys, now the floor is open. Normally not separate questions from comments, so you can make both. And after that, after questions and comments, we will come back to the authors and ask them to respond. Yes,
okay, thank you. I'm not a specialist in digital economy, gig economy, or whatever. I'm just, I was listening to your presentation and I have looked at the text. And as a person, I'm a sociologist, but I have not been involved in this kind of literature. I have a question which was unclear for me. Your main question, research question, was about why are so many business organizations or business formats on this market, and I haven't understood why not. So normally, for example, you have a good argument that there should be one, and then you see the diversity, and then it is then there is a question why are so many. But like if we look at the business organizations not in this sector but in other sectors, we see a diversity of forms. So we can suppose that in this sector we also can observe a diversity of forms. And so it's not very clear why there should be a question like that. And then the classification which you suggest, you justify that this kind of classification was not done in the literature. And then again, okay, not everything which is not done should exist probably. So what is the argument? Why this? What kind of conceptual insights or what kind of explanatory power, explanatory tools can give us the classification which you make? How can it make us better understand how this sector is working? What is the byproduct for this classification? And the last one, yes, I did have the question similar to Kadir, that how your data is related to your conclusions, but you mentioned that in these interviews you have found some relations between different companies. But again, maybe you need somehow to justify or to explain this, because otherwise it looks like you ask questions to employees and then you make conclusions about the business models, which seems to be like not very relevant material or not very relevant sources to make those types of conclusions. That's and for me, for example, but it doesn't matter because I'm not. It's okay. It's probably a different paper. For me, the questions which may be interesting. Also, I mean, because you look at the sector in a particular time, yeah, and we know that this sector is developing rapidly. Maybe this is specificity of the moment, and then it's not something which can give us. Okay, a full description of the moment may not be so insightful in terms of understanding how it works. And maybe tomorrow the situation will change dramatically. And so the questions which may be interesting for sociologists is like, okay, it doesn't matter what is the finance or how they find finance, but for example, the relationships between workers and the company. Like, for example, for sociology of organization, what is important is how control over workers is managed. Yeah, how these diverse and dispersed employees are able to be controlled by the company. Because normally we, like at the university, we have to come, or at the other companies, we have to come to our jobs, and then our bosses, they have kind of more or less control over what we are doing. Yeah, but in this case, these people are like free and more or less independent service providers. And so how, for example, this control is organized, but maybe this is already solved in the literature, I don't know. Or, for example, how the workers become entrepreneurs, actually. What I have understood that because the workers are not proper workers, they are not employees, so all the risks which normally businessmen have, they somehow are given to the workers, and then they become those kind of entrepreneurs. And or another question about these algorithms, which what is actually what are they changing in the nature of the relationship within an organization, and whether it is possible to be called as an organization, maybe it's a completely new phenomenon, something like that. Or, for example, what happens to discrimination, gender, race, ethnical, and other types of what we have in conventional non-digital companies. So something like that. But maybe this is not the focus of your attention. So, but maybe you can comment to some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the text and the presentation. I hope that you can hear me well. So I have two comments. Maybe they were already covered in your previous text papers. If not, maybe you will be curious to listen to them. First comment is connected with the nature of the product, which is realized, sold, and delivered through the platform. So this food, which has its specificities, and as I understood from the paper and from your speech, you do not concentrate on this special product as food. And second comment is about the discussion of the nature of the platforms, food platforms. So firstly, if you talk about food, you mainly talk about quality and price of it, and it is a special product which is should be sold quickly because of its special conditions of storage. Yes, it has special conditions of storage. It has the time while you should use it, actually several days or several weeks. It depends on the product which you sell. Also, the grocery has its system, how it is produced, how it is sold, and to whom. And the question is whether these platforms are making all this, do they actually include it in this processes of storing foods and is interested in how it is sold, or other market players are responsible for that issues about the quality of the food which is delivered to the consumers. Second question about this platform. As I understood from discussion and from your presentation, platform is here as serves as a mediator between consumers and between the market players, which can be differentiated into different categories, shops, food producers, or restaurants. So you can, and there will be different processes how this food will be bought and delivered, and how it is sold. First question is about organization of these food storages. As I have known from this topic, that in order to continue business effectively, some shops, for example, divide these storages into two parts. Some food is delivered directly from the shop, where you can buy it by person, personally come and buy. And another shops has special warehouses or storehouses, special places where only delivers come, take these products from some, fridges or refrigerators or just barcodes and then deliver it to the consumer. And then, like, so how it is organized, do you know it, or do you have any like clue about such a division? And as for the platforms, I think that platforms naturally, like nature of the platforms is that they do not actually possess any resources, like I don't know, do not produce actually food, but serves as like this mediator to sell it. And they also organize the hiring of the workers who are like independent and can change, like can be paid for the tasks or for the time they devote to these delivery services. So you have mentioned actually this how couriers and workers in delivery can work for the delivery platform or for the delivery employee. Or, for example, in Russia, we have taxists who are working as drivers, and they can choose an option in order to like drive a car with the client and make a service for the client, or to be a courier. So are these workers included in these platforms are divided in these two like categories, who are delivers or taxis delivers or otherwise? Thank you.
Thanks. Видно или нет? Или вы делаете?
Ну, лучше вы. Good evening. First of all, thank you for a very comprehensive writing and very comprehensive presentation. I believe your work is very valuable. I'm not a specialist at platform working, but I'm very interested in digitalization processes, so I do believe that it definitely contributes to this area of studies. And my question is, I was pretty much confused at in your conclusion and discussion section. You're writing that your findings are actually relevant, like universally relevant. Let's say you're trying to generalize, and as far as I understood by your answers to the questions of Andrei, you actually mean it that your findings can be applied to any other platforms in any other countries. And at the same time, you mentioned in the limitations, right, in the next paragraph of your work, that actually you limit your studies on Turkey. And I still wonder if it's general or it's only limited to Turkey. Is it applicable to any other platforms in any other countries? This is my one question. And the second question, in your presentation, you mentioned that many platforms are operating overseas. So is their structure similar to the ones which operate in Turkey, or it differs due to different microeconomic factors? Thank you so much.
Thanks. Anyone from online? No. Second go. No, okay. Dear colleagues, let me say a few words. I can sit here. I must say that I enjoyed reading your paper, at least for two reasons. First, it's good and informative and well written. And second, this topic of food delivery platforms is of special interest to me because very recently, and by the end of last year, we finished a special study for a major Russian food delivery platform named Yandex Yeda, or Yandex Food, which is a part of very large IT company Yandex. It is known as Russian Google, or the Russian Google. And this food delivery platform is only a small part of this giant. Our research team, including myself, Zoya Kotelnikova, and two other colleagues of us, and we obtained data from quantitative data directly from the company. And also we get access to the managers and conducted a number of interviews. Unfortunately, I have serious limitations to share the outcomes because it was a commercial study and the results belong to the company, to Yandex Food, Yandex Yeda. We are still waiting them to publish at least some part of these results, but still they have not done it by now. However, I would like to share some of these results to give you an idea of the Russian case of this food delivery market. And when doing that, I will touch upon several issues that might be relevant to your paper, and hopefully it might be interesting to you. First issue, we should keep in mind that food delivery market is very complex and diverse, and digital food delivery platforms make only a small part of it. It's pretty competitive, and platforms are only a minor part of this market. Apart from food delivery platforms, we have direct food delivery from grocery chains, direct delivery from restaurants and cafes, and both might be dominant in the segments of the market. We have deliveries from so-called dark stores. We have deliveries from so-called dark kitchens. We have deliveries of. We have firms providing catering services. It's a separate group of firms. We have firms providing farmers' products. Again, another group of firms. We have one more group of firms providing so-called food sets for healthy and dietary feeding. It's pretty special, but they're progressing, becoming more and more popular. And yes, and finally, we have food delivery platforms. And the role of food delivery platforms largely depends, if we take a worldwide statistics, we actually explore statistics both Russian and worldwide. It largely depends on the market segment. First, if we take deliveries of groceries from the food stores, from grocery stores, here actually direct deliveries from grocery stores are dominant, both in Russia and worldwide. And food delivery platforms play a minor role. If we take ready-made food, the picture is different. Worldwide, digital delivery platforms have already got a dominant position. They provide about 2/3 of all food deliveries. In terms of ready-made food, ready-made meals. In Russia, it's different, and in Russia, food delivery platforms provide only 1/4. So they're growing. They're pretty ambitious, but still they're far from being dominant. That was second point. Next point, regarding business models, let me attract your attention to the fact that these guys, these platforms can combine different business models. In case of Yandex.Eda, they're mainly, in real terms, they are mainly dominant intermediator. They're a real platform. They are 90% dominant intermediate, but at the same time, they're 10% digital storefront. There is a window, just a window for the clients, but they in this case, they do not deliver with their dashers or their couriers. By the way, yes, there is difference in terminology. We know that in English, these guys, you call them delivery drivers, but I know the term dashers. In Russia, we call them couriers, and the company Yandex.Yeda would call them couriers partners, stressing very strictly the point that they are just self-employed, subcontracting workers, and by no means their own employees. Couriers, they're partners. They are not workers, they are not employees. Okay, coming back to Yandex, Yandex Food. Actually, they introduced their app in 2018. They start working in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that in Russia. Now they are covering about 400 Russian cities. They also working in Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, Uzbekistan, yes, four other countries. They're internationalizing. They're mostly working with restaurants, 70% of their deliveries. And as for the grocery chain stores, they're still dominant, as I mentioned before. So they're still struggling to get them. One of the limitations, actually, which was pointed out, that Yandex.Yeda, Yandex Food do not take orders by the phone. Mm-hmm. They're very digital. They're too digital, and many guys, particularly outside of Moscow and other cities, prefer to place orders by telephone. But they are working on that somehow. I don't know. Now, let me make the most important point, or a point which I believe most important for what I'm going to say. And this point is the following. At least in case of Russia, I don't know about Turkey, but it would be interesting to know. Most of these food delivery platforms are unprofitable. Mm-hmm. Unprofitable. To start with, Delivery Club was a veteran of the field, one of the major food delivery platforms. They've been profitable only 1 year, that is 2012. Only 1 year. Now they're sold out to Yandex Food. Mm-hmm. Second, famous Samokat, which was a pioneer, absolute pioneer in fast delivery, and meaning 15 minutes for every order. They were not profitable. Now they sold out to larger bear market platform. Now turn to larger bear market. They are not profitable. But they're part of a large ecosystem and major bear bank, and of course they are cross-subsidized. So all these guys have been cross-subsidized. And actually Yandex.Yeda made, several years ago, made a desperate attempt to make their business profitable. That is to change their, what they call the unit economy. And it was not easy. And by the way, they're all reluctant to talk about that. Yeah. They are not profitable. But that's true. They're cross-subsidized. And to do that, to implement this idea, Yandex.Yeda had to change many things. They had to actually reject a traditional business model. And traditional business model, at least in Russia, was that all these deliveries is some kind of extra services which are provided to the clients for free or at very low price, just to attract the clients. So now they're trying to break through and to change this dominant vision, because I mean the clients are very relaxed in this point. So what they did, they introduced three types of payments. First payments obviously was and is a commission from restaurants and grocery stores. By the way, in Russia, it is up to 35%.
Yeah.
It's flexible, but it's up to 35% if Yandex is providing services of their own partners, like courier, driver, dashers. But it's not the end. They introduced special additional payments for any order, any delivery, because before that it was not so. Most of the deliveries were for free.
Yeah.
Now they are not for free at all, and it was pretty critical. At the first year, the number of orders fell down, but they survived somehow, managed with it somehow. But it's not the end. At some point, they introduced another special payment. They call it service payment, servisный сбор, which is taken from the clients. It was straight, now it's changeable, but 3 types of payments just to make this economy works, to make this profitable, the whole thing profitable. And we still do not know. Well, they must be profitable by now. Let's have that. Next point. All these guys are very technological. This is a very highly technological business, particularly, well, Yandex is a champion, IT champion here in this country. And of course, they introduced a great deal of technological innovations, like they call it surge pricing, surgeon in Russian, meaning dynamic pricing, changing depending on the weather, depending on ongoing demand, depending on number of partners they have at the moment. Actually, the payments for the dashers, for the couriers, for drivers, are also changing this dynamic system, automatic system. It changes depending on the district, on time of the day, day of the week, and all these issues. It's pretty technological. They also introduced interesting thing like electronic menu, paying the checks by QR codes, electronic tips. They introduced dispatch for dashers for these delivery drivers, meaning that they place an order without calls. Although they have call centers with many guys employed, but it's pretty automatic. And what else? Regarding these couriers, their partners, most of them, 3/4 of these dashers are using bikes, 10% using cars, and the rest 15% are pedestrians or going by foot. And actually, the payments is quite different. Are quite different. And of course, they are self-employed. Of course, most of them are on partial employment. And they have 2 channels for getting these dashers. They could hire, or not hire, they're not hiring anyone. They could subcontract them directly, or they can use services of recruiting agencies. And they were very active recruiting, using recruiting agencies previously. Now they almost reject it. So then almost 100% contracting the guys themselves. Although it brings some risks, because from the labor ministry, because they could requalify it as labor relations, but still it's rather delicate issue, of course. So that was my story in brief, and to conclude, let me repeat that this market is pretty diverse, it's pretty competitive, it's very tight technological, and platforms are only part of a minor part of it so far. And at the moment, they're struggling first for gaining a dominant position, and second for gaining their profitability at the same time.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay. Now let us come back to you, and you can respond to any remarks you want.
Sure. So I'll start at the end and go back to my notes. I took a bunch of notes. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. Again, it's a privilege to be talking to you and to hear your ideas and your reflections on our writing. So in terms of similarities with the Yandex food study, everything you told rings true. Like, we've seen it. I've seen it here in the US with other work, but especially in the Turkish market, pretty much everything is on point, right? Like, it's a very complex ecosystem. Grocery stores still appear to be dominant, though I would say in the Turkish case, because the largest grocery store chain in Turkey, Migros, has created its own platform and moved its own delivery services to this platform, probably the scales have tipped. Platforms must account for the majority of the grocery deliveries, at least. Food deliveries, I would say, in a similar fashion, Turkey, again, we don't have hard data, but having been immersed in this field for so long, I would imagine platforms make up a significant portion of it. I can't say that it's a majority just because hard data is nowhere to be found. Just because of these new types of platforms you mentioned that have been basically subcontracting out to individual restaurants, right? And even some of them to neighborhood restaurants, one-off, small places. It just is cheaper for them to subcontract with a delivery platform, a delivery provider platform, rather than have their own dedicated subcontractor on site. So my hunch is those two things are different. But for example, something like unit economics, it really is suspect, right? Again, especially in Europe, we see similar problems, right? We showed that map of Wired where all of these quick delivery platforms have collapsed, and Getir looked like it was the last one remaining. But in the last couple of months, Getir shuttered 3 of its services in the Netherlands, France, and Spain. So those countries just don't have quick delivery of groceries anymore, probably because profitability is nowhere to be found. Again, though, in Turkey itself, there seems to be some amount of unit economics going on, just based on Getir's reports to its funders, because it keeps going into funding rounds and declaring profitability, at least in Turkey. Though most of the reason it gets funding was because it was on this huge acquisition spree. So I don't imagine it's hugely profitable. But also some of these smaller companies we mentioned, they must be making money because they don't have $1 billion in the bank, right? They must be making some sort of money. They don't have any investment. Tech-wise, I would very quickly say, over the last year and a half, we've grown a little suspicious of the tech angle on these platforms. Obviously, they rely on tech to navigate their delivery drivers. They rely on tech to track orders and all that stuff. But how important tech is to stuff like worker control, which was another question at the beginning, we've really begun to question that a little bit, because what we keep finding is a lot of human management, and where we don't find human management, the tech is not doing anything especially difficult or especially more intrusive. It seems to be at best a replacement for some minimal human management functions. But even in some platforms like Paket Taxi, which is owned by the grocery chain Migros, we see a lot of human management, actual shift managers and people assigning deliveries to individual drivers. There's actual humans involved in many of the steps. In terms of the digitalization questions, so between our limitations, are we actually applicable? obviously our data is just based in Turkey, so we are open to finding like limits and problems with applying this in other contexts. But I think the categories we've created and the way we, for example, created these options to classify platforms, right? Like looking at their capital structures, looking at their business models, all that stuff, we think is going to be applicable. So that type of like more theoretical contributions we think are generally applicable, but obviously we're open to finding limits to it, right? Like there might be some room for refinement in these models. In terms of food, like does food delivery make these platforms anything? Does the fact that they're delivering food impact these platforms? Yes, in the sense that these platforms are predicated on quick delivery. It's kind of like how pizza delivery was like really big, like 20, 25 years ago, the half an hour or your pizza is free kind of stuff has been a big part of this, especially with like Q-commerce, quick delivery. Getir promised like 10-minute deliveries and stuff like that. And that really creates huge like organizational differences, right? Like, so it forces platforms to spatially distribute its drivers so that on a map, they're always close to their pickup locations, wherever the pickup locations might be. It creates incentives for Q-commerce platforms to create these dark stores and dark kitchens so that you think you're ordering from a grocery store, but it's actually the like store with the blacked out windows down the street that has these like all the groceries you're actually getting delivered, which is not open to pedestrians, which is not an actual shopping, which doesn't serve any other function but deliveries. And that creates lots of regulatory problems like city planning and zoning problems. Amsterdam was having a huge problem with Getir until they finally shut them down, for example. So there's a whole host of issues that come with it. But I don't think organizationally that really differentiates these from other types of platforms fundamentally, in the sense that, like Andre was saying, like if we were to develop a definition of platforms, which is a really prickly subject, which is really difficult to do, these would look like other platforms, as at least the dominant intermediators, that one specific category. Though I would argue the others have platform-like features at least, right? Like, so they're not fundamentally different than what Amazon does in the US. They're not fundamentally different than what Uber does in the UK. What else am I missing? So do platforms possess resources, or are they just mediators? I think what we're finding is there's a big range, right? Like, so some platforms are just mediators, right? Like that would be our, for example, digital storefront platform. They just have a website and an app, and then everyone else takes care of the rest of the exchange. Other platforms do have some some resources, so they might have like contracts with delivery drivers. They might have contracts with restaurants for exclusivity. Like, we don't think of these as resources, but they are in the like seeing the firm as a nexus of contracts thing, right? Like those are resources they can mobilize. Some of them have actual like physical capacities, right? Like warehouses and like workers in those warehouses, shift managers, and like some of them used to, for example, own the delivery bikes, the motorcycles. So I think there's a big range there. In terms of the last couple of questions, why shouldn't we have diversity? Well, I think because the literature in this field, in the platform economy, has focused a lot on uniformity, right? Like finding diversity on its own isn't that shocking, obviously, other than the fact that the literature has really highlighted a lot of, like in the same country, we would expect similar platforms to happen. Just because that's how platforms are become profitable, by capturing these network effects and turning them into rents. And what we are finding is that's not exactly true, and writing against that literature. So it's not the novelty of finding multiple organizational forms, it's that the multiple organizational forms go against some of the fundamentals of the literature a little bit. what are the uses of the categories? Again, it goes back to the literature debate. Literature has talked about one type of platform fundamentally, and what we're finding, or what we think we're finding, Andrei disagrees, and again, I will think about it hard. I would argue what we're finding is a new type of platform that doesn't seem to operate on the same premises, that its business models, its capital structure doesn't fit those descriptions too much. Finally, just going back to the data question, and is the snapshot relevant of like one study in 2023? Again, my point is that our data, even though we should have made it more clear, includes a lot of like management perspectives, includes a lot of funder perspectives that we just didn't highlight because like my idea was to paint this macro picture rather than like, hey, this funder said they were giving money for that, that funder said they were giving money for this. It just got a little too much detail, but we should make that clear. I appreciate that comment. Is the snapshot relevant? I think it is, again, for more theoretical perspectives than for like business perspectives, right? Like the forms are changing. We already, just preparing for this, we found out one of our ancillary platforms actually got bought out by a venture capital firm. So things seem to be changing a lot, but I think capturing that moment is useful because it gives us an opportunity to understand, again, like how different dynamics than the ones that are in the literature seem to be at play. I will finish here just because we've hit the 2-hour mark. I don't want to take anyone else's time more. Again, I really appreciate getting to talk to all of you. I appreciate the discussants' comments. I appreciate the audience's questions and comments. We have a lot of thinking to do, and it was really fun to get to talk about this paper that's been in our heads for 8 months, and we've been struggling to get it out.
Okay, so thank you so much for your contribution. We've come to the end of our seminar. Thanks to first to the authors, to our discussants, and to everyone who took part in it. See you in 1 week. Yeah.